Okay, so I would ask you all to actually go back to Henry V's time, and when that play was first written by Shakespeare, the call to the imagination was when a single actor on the stage with very little props called to the audience to imagine everything that was about to be said with all of the trimmings behind it. So I'm asking you to kind of imagine a world in which we can actually feed people, and we have a society, as in Bruegel's painting there, as going from the Tibet plateaus, where we have an environment where people want to live, coupled with a productive agro-ecosystem, into the future. And that's the vision. The vision is to be able to deliver this food alongside the environmental issues that we face. The perfect storm that James alluded to was by the government's chief scientist, Sir John Beddington, who highlighted that we would need this increase in food by 2030. He used that because it was a year in which we could all lock on to that, very differently from, say, 2100, which is somewhat into the future. And these coming together would create the perfect storm. So that rather than that idealistic, beautiful vision which we all want, we would end up in a Sodom and Gomorrah type situation in which that's not a world I'm sure that many people want to live in. What's driving this? Well, let's give you a bit of a background to what's going on, and then I perhaps offer an idea worth spreading in terms of a way in which we can address it. Here we have the population increase, well on the way to 8 billion now. The 7th billionth person was born in a hospital in Manila, the Philippines, called Danica, according to the United Nations. How they knew that was the 7th billion is up to them to decide. But you can see this rapid increase in population, which is causing many of the issues. So that massive increase in population is coupled with the world not expanding alongside it. So if we look at the actual amount of land where you can grow food on, it's relatively small, as you can see for that red light there within the apple. And if we actually look at the population increase, you can radically and rapidly see how the amount of land per person is dropping, and therefore the ability to produce enough food for that increasing population becomes a challenge. Coupled with that, we have dietary change. So as people often become wealthier in countries like, for instance, China, you get a big switch away from vegetarian-based diets towards meat and dairy-based diets, in which the inefficiency comes in which large amounts of grain are fed to dairy-producing organisms to generate the meat that we need, and that in turn means that we have the shift which will put increasing pressure on the ability to generate enough food. And the final aspect, although there are dozens others I could talk about, is the climate change scenario. Here we have a picture which illustrates to you that in a future world, most parts of the world will be less productive in what food they produce rather than more productive. Here we're quite lucky, and actually in Northern Europe we're very likely to have to be the bread baskets of the world, and assuming we have a stable society and world peace, distribution might help. But as you can see, large tracts of the world, and especially India, Africa, parts of Australia, will be less productive than they are currently. So what is food security? Because I've talked a lot about production here, but I think the important point to realise is that food security is not just about producing food, it's people having access to food, or food which is healthy and nutritious and can be prepared properly, and all of those things together stably produced. And that's where sustainability comes in terms of how can we have sustainable food security. And why food security? Well, I would argue food security is absolutely fundamental to the other Millennium Development Goals. These key targets for the world were established for how the world would do, and they measure the effects of it in 2015. And food security has implications on 3 of the other Millennium Development Goals. So 50% of the world's targets, as determined by the United Nations and the world leaders, are either food security itself or have direct links to the consequences associated with food security. So what I hopefully have demonstrated to you is that actually, whether it be from climate change, population increase, consumer behaviour change, we are facing a very difficult time in terms of food security for everybody on planet Earth. The vision, as I asked you to think about, was actually, can we feed those people and maintain a landscape that we want to live in? Several years ago, some of the organisations around the world, here we have the Royal Society and we have the government's Foresight report, suggested that a way to do this was what they called sustainable intensification. That is, we would intensify production because of the increasing demands, but we would do it sustainably. Many people are concerned about that word intensification because typically, as shown here, if we look at birds in the UK, birds are very well studied in the UK because there are huge numbers of people who walk our countryside and can give, like the RSPB had the Birdwatch weekend just a few weekends ago, and it's been demonstrated that the birds on farmlands have dramatically decreased at the same period of time that intensification of agriculture has happened in the UK or in Europe. So the question is how can you intensify and not have scenarios like that developing? And that's where this definition comes in the sense of starting to value what is called natural capital, starting to look at the flow of benefits from the environment to mankind. And the United Nations, too, are putting these sorts of words into their documents. I think this is a good sign because what it illustrates is some of the important decision-making bodies in society are beginning to recognise this term and use it. And in James' world, their reports in the future will not have any other word in it. But the point being, it started to happen. So I'm really pleased by this and I'm optimistic. So the United Nations here are illustrating to you reports about how they're beginning to think about it. The World Bank in 2005 produced the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, which began to show how you, people, benefit from the environment. The environment's ability to clean your water, provide you fresh air, make you feel better, provide your food, your fibre, your fuel. And ecosystem services has been a way in which people begin to look at this value which comes from the land. Agriculture relies on lots of these to come to it from the wider landscape, and it affects lots of others. And what this report has shown, which I think is quite interesting, using a nice analogy of like flower petals, is that if you look here on the left-hand side, an agricultural system, typically we take loads of things out of it, food, fibre, fuel, and it's not really well managed for the things which help support and regulate that system. If we compare that with a natural ecosystem, say like a tropical rainforest or something like that, very little is taken out of it, and those other types of services are very big. And the idea that I propose to you that's worth spreading, and an idea that United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization are talking about, is we need to create this system in which we have lots coming out to be able to feed people alongside also managing the system for these other purposes. And I'm going to just show you now how we might do that, because the planetary boundaries are beginning to get exceeded. This sort of diagram has shown that biodiversity loss is way beyond the level which will support life on Earth going forward. Not only that, but we also know that from a social perspective, even though at the planetary scale things are out of control, at the local scale there's lots of people who need more food, need more energy. So there's a conflict between people saying we shouldn't take any more because we've exceeded the planetary boundaries, and others saying, but there's social injustice. There's people that need more. And how do we get a situation in which calories are overconsumed, say, in North America and underconsumed in Africa? And can we just simply swap the two, and is that a way forward? Probably not. And I'm going to talk to you about a project that we're involved in, which is actually trying to take a new way, a new ecosystem type way to deliver food alongside a sustainable environment. And we're working in Malawi, in the Zomba region in southern Malawi, and in Colombia in South America. And what we're doing is we're working in a place where there are 550 million people around the world live in this type of environment where the forest joins the agro system, And therefore, we're talking about, at this moment in time, 1 in 15 people live in this type of situation. And it's often the very poorest people in the world. Because what happens is you go from these forested areas through a deforestation period, which often leads to a tipping point, some of the issues that James spoke about. So how do we actually manage this system? Because our goal is, here we have a community in the Amazonas region of Colombia who have mapped out how they live in the ecosystem and how they take things from it. And we're working with these communities to try and enable them to have a food and nutritionally secure lifestyle, but in a sustainable fashion, so we don't get the tragedy of the commons as somewhat occurs. It's a very complex system. You might be surprised, but that is oversimplistic representation of what their type of environment looks like. So we've said, well, and this is a scientific view, so they're quite different. One is kind of a lot of arrows, and another is a very a structured thing. But what we're doing here is a thing called the drivers, pressures, states, impacts, responses. Remember that, DIPS here. It's used through governments around the world to try and manage environmental issues. And so what are we doing? Well, we are trying to understand what is driving and causing pressure in people living in poor regions of the world in these agricultural forest environments. And here we have in Zomba Plateau, there's the Zomba Mountains in the distance there. And so what we can do, and I run through this very fast, but is we can actually work with the community to begin to understand by getting them to communicate to you how they use the environment, how they cope with seasonal stresses, how they cope when suddenly there's a catastrophe and they have to deal with it. Because gathering that information enables us to look at the impacts. It enables us to look at the government responses and what needs to change to enable those people to actually have a more sustainable future. And then when we have that information, having worked with those communities around the world, we can then use mathematical models, economic models, and a whole range of other models to actually paint futures, paint how we should manage the system in the future, how government policy should act, how village chiefs should structure their society to enable the community to be more sustainable in their living. So here we have Zomba, the Zomba area, and we have a village that we worked in. And what we've been able to do using modelling is actually map where the water flows to. Very, very important. Without water, there is no agriculture, there is no life. So we need to know where that flows. We need to know the major resources of forest where the communities are in red here, go to actually access the forests. We then need to know where they get things coming from the outside world or transmit things to the outside world. And there we have a road showing that. And here we have a zone. We call that the area of critical flow. Why do we call that the area of critical flow? Because that is like spaghetti junction on the motorway systems. If that area is disturbed, it causes chaos because so much else of what's going on in that environment is influenced by that area of critical flow. In the same way as if you take out a major junction in a motorway type system, it causes much greater chaos than maybe just a closure of one or two of the other important roads. So we are working with the community, mapping where they get things from, and then using mathematical models, able to determine what's the important area to conserve. And finally, we can actually then begin to see how to move forward. So, Zomba, firewood to ensure food security. That's what happens. Problem, too much firewood collected. Deforestation leads to food insecurity because you can no longer have trees to help cook your food and no longer have wild environments to go and get food. A problem. How do you manage that? You can perhaps try to stop over-collection, or you can actually provide charcoal or other forms of cooking so that people don't collect firewood from the forest. So here we have an example of we learnt from the community what they were doing, we modelled what was happening from a critical flow point of view, and we actually here produce a management response. And working in Colombia and Malawi, that is what we are going to be doing in the future with this range of organisations. And I'd just like to thank the team the people that we've worked with and highlight there our Facebook and Twitter account. Please look in on our sites. Please watch what we're doing over the next 4 years. And I hope that the idea that we've proposed will be the future way in which we sustainably feed the world. Thank you.